James Ford, The Orange Grove Murders. Execution date, February 13, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 26 years. State, Florida. The witnesses were already seated. Behind reinforced glass, they waited in complete silence. Some had rehearsed this moment in their minds for decades. Others had spent sleepless nights wondering if the execution would be delayed one final time. Correctional officers moved through the chamber with quiet precision. Every strap had been checked, every procedure reviewed, every clock synchronized. Outside Florida State Prison, television crews stood behind barricades as another chapter in America's long debate over capital punishment prepared to unfold. Inside, one man had stopped wondering whether his sentence would ever be carried out. After 26 years on Florida's death row, James Ford had reached the end of every appeal, every legal challenge, and every hope that another court might intervene. For Florida, this wasn't simply another execution. It was the first execution of what would become the state's most aggressive year of capital punishment in modern history. Long before witnesses entered that chamber on February 13, 2025, another scene had been frozen in time, not inside a prison, inside an orange grove. Nearly 28 years earlier, Greg and Kimberly Malnery set out with their 22-month-old daughter for what should have been an ordinary afternoon in rural Charlotte County. Greg worked with heavy equipment and had traveled to inspect machinery. Kimberly accompanied him. So did their little girl. Nothing about the trip suggested danger. To them, it was simply another family outing. To prosecutors, it became the setting for one of Florida's most devastating double murders. According to evidence presented at trial, James Ford approached the couple while they were in the grove. The encounter quickly escalated into violence. Greg fought to protect his wife and daughter. He never had the chance. Investigators concluded he was attacked first and fatally beaten. Kimberly was then overpowered. According to prosecutors, she endured a brutal sexual assault before she too was murdered. By the time the violence ended, 2 young parents were dead. But one member of the family was still alive, their little daughter. Unable to understand what had happened, she wandered alone through the grove for hours. When workers eventually discovered the toddler, she was dehydrated, frightened, and covered in dirt, but physically unharmed. The image haunted investigators. A child, too young to explain what she had witnessed, had become the only surviving member of her family. For detectives, every minute mattered. The Orange Grove was transformed into a massive crime scene. Forensic teams documented tire tracks, footprints, blood evidence, and personal belongings scattered across the area. Witnesses described vehicles seen nearby. Investigators reconstructed the family's final movements. Piece by piece, attention turned toward James Ford. Physical evidence recovered from the scene, along with additional forensic findings, connected him to the murders. The investigation steadily narrowed. By the time Ford was arrested, prosecutors believed they had assembled an overwhelming case. The trial drew statewide attention. Jurors listened as forensic specialists described the evidence. Medical examiners explained the extent of the victim's injuries. Investigators walked the courtroom through the timeline that began with an ordinary family outing and ended in unimaginable violence. The defense challenged aspects of the state's case and urged jurors to reject the death penalty. But prosecutors argued that the brutality of the crimes, coupled with the presence of the surviving child, made this one of the most aggravated murder cases Florida had ever prosecuted. The jury agreed. James Ford was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death. That sentence began a journey lasting more than a quarter of a century. Appeals followed. Attorneys challenged forensic evidence. Constitutional arguments reached state and federal courts. Execution dates came and went. Each review forced Greg and Kimberly's loved ones to relive the case once again. Every denial brought temporary closure. Every new filing reopened old wounds. Years became decades. Children who had not even been born when the murders occurred became adults. Florida governors changed, judges retired, attorneys came and went. Yet James Ford remained on death row. Then came 2025. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the first death warrant of the year. For Ford's attorneys, the race against time began immediately. Emergency motions were filed with the Florida Supreme Court. Federal courts reviewed the latest challenges. The arguments were familiar. The court's answers were equally familiar. Relief denied. Execution affirmed. As February 13th approached, preparations inside Florida State Prison quietly accelerated. Witness lists were finalized. Victims' relatives confirmed attendance. Correctional officers rehearsed every step that would unfold inside the execution chamber. For Ford, the calendar had finally run out. On the morning of his execution, he met privately with his attorneys. He received visits from spiritual advisors. He was served his final meal of steak, macaroni and cheese, fried okra, and pumpkin pie. As evening approached, officers escorted him from death row. The same corridor he had walked for decades now led somewhere different. Witnesses stood as he entered the chamber. The room fell silent. Before the lethal injection began, Ford declined making a final statement, though he left a brief written note saying, "Hugs, prayers, love, God bless everybody." Moments later, the execution proceeded. At 6:19 p.m., James Ford was pronounced dead. The first execution of Florida's extraordinary 2025 had been completed. For the Department of Corrections, another sentence had been carried out according to law. For many observers, it marked the beginning of a year unlike any other. But for Greg and Kimberly Malnery's family, February 13th wasn't about the man who died. It was about the two people who never had the chance to grow old together, a husband, a wife, two young parents whose daughter spent nearly her entire life carrying the memory of a day she was too young to understand. The execution closed one legal chapter. It could never rewrite the one that mattered most. February 2025, one execution completed. Florida's execution chamber would not remain quiet for long. Just 5 weeks later, another death warrant carried the name of a man convicted of murdering an 8-year-old girl and her grandmother. Unlike the first execution of the year, this case would force the courts to confront claims that the condemned inmate's declining cognitive health should prevent the sentence from being carried out. Edward Thomas James. The grandmother and granddaughter murders execution date, March 20th, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 31 years. State, Florida. Death row teaches patience, not the kind people choose, the kind measured in decades, every appeal, every court hearing, every denied motion. For more than 30 years, Edward Thomas James lived inside Florida's prison system, knowing that one document, signed by a governor, could suddenly end everything. That document finally arrived in early 2025. By then, the legal arguments had changed. The murders hadn't. Instead, James's attorneys argued something entirely different. They claimed the man Florida intended to execute was no longer the same person sentenced decades earlier. Following a heart attack in prison, they argued he had suffered significant cognitive decline, memory loss, and symptoms consistent with dementia. Executing him, they said, would violate the Constitution. Florida's courts reviewed the evidence. Medical experts testified. Judges examined neurological evaluations and prison medical records. Ultimately, every court reached the same conclusion. Edward James understood why he had been sentenced to die. The execution would proceed. For the families of 58-year-old grandmother Betty Dick and her 8-year-old Tony Neuner, however, those medical debates never changed what happened on one horrifying night in September 1993. Betty was a grandmother. She had devoted much of her life to raising and protecting her family. Tony was only 8 years old. She loved school. She loved spending time with her grandmother. She had an entire childhood waiting ahead of her. According to prosecutors, neither survived the night Edward James forced his way into their lives. Investigators later determined that James entered the home where Betty and Tony were staying. The evidence presented at trial showed that both victims were sexually assaulted before being murdered. The brutality stunned even experienced homicide detectives. 2 generations of the same family. A grandmother. A little girl. Both killed inside a place where they should have been safest. When investigators arrived, they immediately realized this was no ordinary homicide. Crime scene technicians spent days documenting physical evidence. Biological samples were carefully preserved. Fingerprints were collected. Every room inside the residence was examined. At first, detectives had no obvious suspect, but advances in forensic science, combined with witness interviews and physical evidence, gradually narrowed the investigation. Attention increasingly focused on Edward James. According to prosecutors, DNA evidence became one of the strongest pillars of the state's case. Investigators also uncovered additional evidence linking James to the crime scene. By the time he was arrested, detectives believed they had reconstructed nearly every major event leading to the murders. For Betty's and Tony's loved ones, the arrest finally brought answers. It could never bring them back. The trial became one of the region's most emotional capital prosecutions. Jurors listened as prosecutors reconstructed the final hours of both victims. Forensic specialists explained the physical evidence. Medical examiners described the injuries. Witnesses recounted the investigation that ultimately identified Edward James as the man responsible. The defense challenged portions of the prosecution's evidence and argued against the death penalty. Jurors nevertheless found James guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. Over the next 3 decades, his case moved repeatedly through Florida's appellate courts. Constitutional claims, sentencing challenges, federal review. Each appeal extended the legal process. None changed the verdict. Then, in 2023, James suffered a serious heart attack while incarcerated. His attorneys argued the medical emergency had permanently impaired his cognitive functioning. They claimed he struggled with memory, confusion, and other neurological deficits severe enough to make him ineligible for execution. Mental health specialists examined him. Medical records were reviewed. Florida's courts acknowledged his health problems but concluded that he still understood both his punishment and the reason it had been imposed. The United States Supreme Court declined to intervene. The legal process that had stretched across 31 years was over. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant. On March 20th, 2025, Edward James spent his final day inside Florida State Prison. He met privately with his attorneys. He received visits from spiritual advisors. He was served his final meal while correctional officers quietly prepared the execution chamber. Outside the prison gates, reporters assembled once again. Florida's second execution of the year was about to begin. As evening approached, James was escorted into the chamber. Witnesses entered behind reinforced glass. The room became silent. Before the lethal injection began, James offered a brief final statement expressing remorse and apologizing to the victims' families. Moments later, the execution proceeded. Edward Thomas James was pronounced dead. For prison officials, another lawful sentence had been carried out. For legal scholars, the case became another example of courts confronting questions about cognitive decline, aging inmates, and the constitutional limits of capital punishment. But for Betty Dick's family, and for Tony Neuner's family, the legal arguments had never been the story. A grandmother had lost her life protecting the home she loved. An 8-year-old girl never had the chance to grow beyond childhood. School pictures became memorial photographs, birthdays became anniversaries, and every passing year served as another reminder of the future that had been stolen. More than 3 decades after the murders, Florida carried out the sentence imposed by the courts. The appeals had ended. The debates had ended. The grief had not. The execution chamber would not remain empty for long. March 2025, 2 executions completed. Florida's death chamber fell silent once again, but only for a few weeks. The next warrant had already been signed. The next story wouldn't begin with an execution. It would begin with a vacation. A woman traveled to Florida expecting sunshine and memories. Instead, she encountered a stranger who would turn her holiday into one of the state's most notorious abduction murders, Michael Tanzi. The tourist abduction murder execution date, April 8th, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 25 years. State, Florida. Janet Acosta came to Florida looking for sunshine. Like millions of visitors every year, she expected beaches, warm weather, and memories she could take home. Instead, she disappeared. By the time investigators found her, One family vacation had become one of South Florida's most disturbing murder investigations. Long before Michael Tanzi entered Florida's execution chamber in 2025, Janet was simply enjoying another evening in Miami. She had no connection to organized crime, no dangerous lifestyle, no reason to believe someone had already decided she would never leave the state alive. On April 25, 2000, Janet sat inside her van outside a business in Miami-Dade County. According to prosecutors, Michael Tanzi approached her without warning. Within moments, the encounter turned into a violent kidnapping. Authorities later determined that Tanzi forced Janet into her own vehicle and drove away. Unlike many murders that unfold within minutes, this crime stretched across South Florida. As investigators later reconstructed the timeline, they discovered Janet remained alive for hours. She was forced to withdraw money from ATMs. She was robbed. She was driven across multiple counties while desperately hoping someone might notice something was wrong. Every surveillance camera, every bank transaction, every eyewitness would later become another piece of the investigation, but none of it saved her. According to prosecutors, Tanzi eventually drove Janet toward the Florida Keys. The roads became quieter, the traffic disappeared. The opportunities for escape became almost impossible. Somewhere near Cudjoe Key, investigators said Tanzi stopped the vehicle and led Janet into a remote area. There, prosecutors argued, he strangled her to death before abandoning her body and driving away in her van. The following days became a nightmare for Janet's family. Phone calls went unanswered. Friends searched. Police issued alerts. Detectives followed every lead they could find. Then came the discovery no family ever wants to hear. Janet's body had been found. The vacation was over. The homicide investigation had begun. Detectives immediately focused on retracing her final hours. Fortunately, Michael Tanzi had unknowingly left investigators a trail. ATM surveillance images, bank withdrawals, witnesses who remembered seeing Janet's van. Every new piece of evidence narrowed the timeline. As investigators compared surveillance footage from different locations, the same man repeatedly appeared. His movements matched Janet's. His actions matched the prosecution's theory. Authorities identified him as Michael Tanzi. The search ended quickly. Law enforcement officers located him while he was still using Janet's vehicle and property. According to prosecutors, additional evidence recovered after his arrest strengthened the case significantly. The physical evidence, financial records, witness testimony. For investigators, the pieces fit together with remarkable consistency. The trial that followed revealed just how calculated the crime had been. Prosecutors argued that Janet had remained alive for much of the kidnapping, forced to comply while Tanzi robbed her before ultimately deciding she could not be left alive. Jurors listened as investigators reconstructed nearly every movement from the abduction through the final discovery of her body. The defense acknowledged many of the underlying facts but argued against imposing the death penalty, presenting evidence about Tanzi's difficult upbringing, substance abuse, and mental health history. The prosecution responded that none of those circumstances explained the deliberate decisions made throughout the kidnapping. After deliberation, the jury found Michael Tanzi guilty. The sentence was death. For Janet's family, the conviction ended one chapter. Another had only begun. For the next 25 years, the case moved through Florida's appellate system. State courts reviewed the conviction. Federal judges examined constitutional claims. Attorneys challenged sentencing procedures. Execution dates were postponed. New petitions appeared. Old arguments returned. Every appeal meant another wait for Janet's loved ones. Every denial brought them one step closer to the sentence first imposed decades earlier. By early 2025, Florida's execution schedule was beginning to accelerate. Governor Ron DeSantis signed another death warrant. This one carried Michael Tanzi's name. His attorneys immediately filed emergency motions. They argued that his long-standing obesity and serious medical conditions could complicate Florida's lethal injection protocol and amount to cruel and unusual punishment. Medical experts were consulted. Courts reviewed the claims. The Florida Supreme Court denied relief. The United States Supreme Court declined to intervene. The execution would move forward. On April 8, 2025, Tanzi spent his final day inside Florida State Prison. He met privately with legal counsel. He received visits from a spiritual advisor. While correctional officers quietly prepared the execution chamber, Tanzi was served his final meal of a fried pork chop, bacon, a baked potato, corn, ice cream, and a candy bar. Outside the prison, journalists gathered once again. Florida had now scheduled its third execution of the year. As evening approached, Tanzi was escorted into the chamber. Witnesses entered behind reinforced glass. The room became silent. Before the procedure began, Tanzi offered a brief final statement expressing remorse and apologizing to Janet Acosta's family. Moments later, the execution proceeded. At 6:12 p.m., Michael Tanzi was pronounced dead. The third execution of Florida's extraordinary 2025 had been completed. For prison officials, another warrant had been fulfilled. For the courts, decades of litigation had reached their conclusion. But for Janet Acosta's family, the execution could never restore the daughter whose vacation ended in unimaginable violence. She came to Florida expecting memories. Instead, she became one. A reminder that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from the places we travel, but from the strangers we never expected to meet. April 2025, 3 executions completed. 3 executions. 2 decades-old murder cases finally reached their legal end. Florida's death chamber would not remain quiet for long. Less than a month later, another death warrant carried the name of a decorated military veteran whose defense argued that the battlefield, not evil, had shaped the man who would soon face execution. Jeffrey Hutchinson, the family massacre execution date, May 1st, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 24-year state, Florida. The signature itself took only seconds, a single stroke of a pen, a governor's seal, another death warrant. But for Jeffrey Hutchinson, that signature erased nearly 24 years of uncertainty. For almost a quarter of a century, he had lived inside Florida's death row, wondering whether the courts would eventually overturn his sentence or whether the state would finally carry it out. By the spring of 2025, that question had finally been answered. Unlike many inmates awaiting execution, Hutchinson's final legal battle wasn't centered on new forensic evidence. It centered on his mind. His attorneys argued that the man Florida planned to execute wasn't simply a convicted murderer. He was a decorated Gulf War veteran suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. For years, psychologists, military experts, and defense attorneys argued that combat had permanently altered the way Hutchinson processed reality. They claimed the jury never fully understood what years of military service had done to him. Florida prosecutors saw the case very differently. They acknowledged his military background, but they argued that trauma could not explain away deliberate murder. As the execution date approached, emergency motions reached the courts once again. The Florida Supreme Court reviewed the filings. Federal judges examined additional claims. One by one, every request failed. After decades of litigation, the legal road had finally reached its end. For the families of the victims, the governor's signature meant something entirely different. It meant another painful anniversary was approaching. Not the anniversary of the execution, the anniversary of the night their family disappeared forever. On September 11, 1998, deputies responded to a home in Crestview, Florida, after reports of a shooting. What they discovered stunned even experienced investigators. Inside the residence lay 4 victims: Jeffrey Hutchinson's wife, Renee, age 32, their 9-year-old son, Jeffrey, and 2 daughters, Amanda, age 7, and Logan, age 4. 4 members of one family, all killed inside the place that should have protected them. Jeffrey Hutchinson survived. From the beginning, he insisted unknown intruders had entered the home and carried out the murders. Investigators immediately examined that possibility. Crime scene specialists searched for signs of forced entry. Detectives interviewed neighbors. Forensic analysts reconstructed the sequence of events. As the investigation progressed, the intruder theory began collapsing. Physical evidence failed to support Hutchinson's account. Instead, prosecutors argued that the evidence consistently pointed toward the only surviving adult inside the home. The investigation gradually transformed from a search for unknown killers into a case against Jeffrey Hutchinson himself. His arrest shocked many who knew him. He had served honorably in the United States Army. Friends described him as disciplined. Others remembered the psychological changes they believed followed his military service. Those two competing images would dominate the trial. Prosecutors focused on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and inconsistencies in Hutchinson's statements. The defense focused on combat. Psychologists testified about post-traumatic stress disorder. Military service records were introduced. Experts explained how severe trauma could affect perception, memory, and emotional control. Jurors spent weeks weighing two very different explanations. One argued calculated murder, the other argued a damaged mind. Ultimately, they sided with the prosecution. Jeffrey Hutchinson was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. For the next 24 years, the legal battle never truly stopped. Appeals moved through Florida's courts. Federal judges reviewed constitutional claims. Mental health evaluations continued. Defense attorneys argued that Hutchinson's PTSD should prevent his execution. Prosecutors responded that every court had already considered those arguments. Each new appeal ended the same way. The convictions remained. So did the sentence. By 2025, Florida's execution schedule was rapidly accelerating. James Ford, Edward James, Michael Tanzi, now Jeffrey Hutchinson, 4 executions. Inside Florida State Prison, preparations quietly intensified. Witnesses confirmed attendance. Security procedures were reviewed. Correctional officers rehearsed the carefully choreographed routine that precedes every execution. On May 1st, Hutchinson spent his final hours meeting privately with attorneys, family members, and his spiritual advisor. Outside the prison, demonstrators gathered on both sides of the death penalty debate. Some argued justice had waited long enough. Others questioned whether a combat veteran suffering from severe psychological trauma should be executed. Inside the prison walls, the debate no longer mattered. The courts had spoken. As evening approached, officers escorted Hutchinson into the execution chamber. Witnesses stood silently behind reinforced glass. Before the lethal injection began, Hutchinson maintained his innocence, insisting until the very end that he had not murdered his family. Moments later, the execution proceeded. At 8:15 p.m., Jeffrey Hutchinson was pronounced dead. Florida had now carried out its 4th execution of 2025. For many observers, the case remained one of the state's most emotionally complex capital prosecutions. It forced difficult conversations about military service, combat trauma, mental illness, and criminal responsibility. But for Renee, Jeffrey, Amanda, and Logan's loved ones, those debates never changed the reality they had lived with since September 1998. A mother, a little boy, twin daughters, 4 empty places at every holiday table, 4 voices permanently missing from every family gathering. The execution ended Jeffrey Hutchinson's story. It never ended theirs. May 2025. 4 executions completed. Florida's execution schedule was beginning to accelerate, yet the next warrant belonged to a man whose crimes stretched far beyond one community. For years, investigators debated how many women he had really killed. By mid-May, Florida was preparing to execute one of America's most notorious predators. Glen Rogers, the cross-country predator. Execution date, May 15, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 27 years. State, Florida. By the middle of May, Florida had already carried out 3 executions. The pace was beginning to attract national attention. Death warrants were being signed faster than many legal observers expected. Families prepared for long-awaited court decisions. Attorneys worked around the clock, filing emergency motions. Inside Florida State Prison, correctional officers quietly prepared the execution chamber yet again. But this execution carried something the previous 3 did not: a reputation. Long before Glen Rogers entered Florida's death chamber, America already knew his name. Television documentaries called him the Casanova Killer. Investigators in multiple states questioned whether he had murdered far more people than prosecutors had ever proven. Over the years, Rogers made sensational claims about additional killings. Some investigators dismissed them as desperate attempts for attention. Others spent years trying to separate fact from fiction. But Florida's death warrant wasn't based on rumors. It wasn't based on speculation. It was based on one woman, a 34-year-old mother of two, Tina Marie Cribbs. For nearly 3 decades, her family waited while headlines focused on the man who killed her. The execution was finally bringing the attention back where they believed it belonged, to the victim. In September 1995, Tina Cribbs was enjoying an ordinary evening in Tampa. Friends remembered her as outgoing and independent. She laughed easily. She trusted people. That trust would become fatal. According to prosecutors, Tina met Glen Rogers at a neighborhood bar. To everyone watching, nothing appeared unusual. A conversation, a drink, 2 adults leaving together. No one imagined they were witnessing Tina's final hours alive. The following morning, a passerby made a horrifying discovery. Tina's body had been abandoned in a remote area outside the city. She had been stabbed repeatedly. The violence shocked even experienced homicide investigators. Detectives immediately began reconstructing her final night. Bartenders were interviewed, customers were identified, receipts examined, witnesses described the man seen leaving with Tina. One description appeared again: tall, charming, soft-spoken, a stranger calling himself Glen Rogers. By then, authorities in Kentucky were already searching for the same man. Another woman had recently been murdered. The similarities immediately caught investigators' attention. For the first time, detectives began asking whether Tina's killer had done this before. The investigation rapidly expanded beyond Florida. Police departments exchanged information. The FBI became involved. Murder cases from multiple states were compared. Patterns emerged. The victims shared striking similarities. Most were women. Most had recently met Rogers. Several disappeared after being seen alone with him. Within days, Kentucky State Police stopped Rogers while he was driving Tina Cribbs' stolen vehicle. The arrest ended one manhunt. It began something much larger. As investigators searched deeper into Rogers' past, more unsolved cases surfaced. Then came the confessions. During interviews over the following years, Rogers claimed responsibility for numerous murders across the United States. Some claims were investigated and rejected. Others could never be fully verified. The uncertainty only fueled public fascination. Books followed. Television specials aired. Speculation spread across the country. But inside the Florida courtroom, prosecutors remained focused on what they could prove: the murder of Tina Cribbs. Jurors listened as prosecutors reconstructed Tina's final hours through eyewitness testimony, forensic evidence, and physical evidence recovered after Rogers' arrest. The timeline was methodical. The evidence was extensive. The prosecution argued that Tina had unknowingly trusted a violent predator whose pattern was already beginning to emerge. The defense challenged portions of the evidence and argued against imposing the death penalty. They presented testimony about Rogers' abusive childhood, psychological problems, and unstable upbringing. Jurors considered everything. Then they returned with the same conclusion prosecutors had sought. Glen Rogers was guilty. The sentence was death. For the next 27 years, Rogers remained one of Florida's most recognizable death row inmates. Not because of appeals alone, because public fascination never disappeared. Every few years, another documentary appeared, another interview, another theory, another debate over how many victims he may actually have claimed. Yet none of those questions changed Florida's legal responsibility. Its courts had convicted Rogers for the murder of Tina Cribbs. That conviction remained intact through decades of appeals. By 2025, another death warrant carried his name. Emergency petitions reached the Florida Supreme Court. Federal courts reviewed additional filings. Every request was denied. The execution would proceed. On May 15, 2025, Rogers spent his final day inside Florida State Prison. He met with attorneys. He received visits from spiritual advisors. He was served his final meal while prison staff completed the now familiar preparations inside the execution chamber. Outside, media organizations from across the country gathered. This wasn't simply another execution. It was the closing chapter of one of America's most notorious serial murder investigations. As evening approached, Rogers entered the chamber. Witnesses watched from behind reinforced glass. Before the lethal injection began, Rogers delivered a brief final statement expressing love for his family while maintaining that his soul belonged to God. Moments later, the execution proceeded. At 6:16 p.m., Glen Rogers was pronounced dead. Florida had now completed its fifth execution of 2025. For many Americans, the execution ended decades of speculation surrounding one of the country's most infamous predators. For Tina Cribb's family, however, there had never been any mystery. Their daughter left home one evening expecting to return. She never did. The documentaries, the headlines, the theories. None of them mattered as much as the life that had been stolen. Nearly 30 years later, justice finally reached its legal conclusion. Their loss never would. May 2025. 5 executions completed. If you are a true crime fan and want deeply researched deep dives like this every single week, drop a like on the video right now so the algorithm shares these victims' stories. Florida's execution schedule continued to accelerate. Summer was approaching. Another warrant had already been signed, but the next execution would begin not inside a courtroom, nor inside an execution chamber. It would begin behind prison walls, where 2 escaped inmates crossed a state line, and an ordinary trip to the grocery store became the beginning of one of Florida's largest interstate manhunts. Anthony Wainwright, the escapee killer, execution date June 10, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 30 years. State, Florida. Every prison escape creates the same question: how long before someone gets hurt? For correctional officers, it's more than a security failure. It's a race against time. Every passing hour means another stolen vehicle, another robbery, another family who may unknowingly cross paths with someone desperate enough to do anything to avoid capture. By June 2025, Florida had already carried out 5 executions. The death chamber had become increasingly active, but the next warrant belonged to a man whose journey to death row had begun not with a courtroom, but with a prison break. For more than 3 decades, the name Anthony Wainwright reminded investigators across the Southeast of one terrifying truth. Sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who have nothing left to lose. Only days before the murder that would send him to Florida's death row, Wainwright and fellow inmate Richard Hamilton escaped from a correctional facility in North Carolina. The escape immediately triggered a multi-state manhunt. Police agencies across the South exchanged intelligence. Roadblocks appeared on major highways. Television stations interrupted regular programming with photographs of the fugitives. Citizens were warned, do not approach them. They were considered armed and extremely dangerous. Hundreds of miles away, 23-year-old Carmen Gayhart had no idea any of this was happening. She had recently graduated from college. Friends described her as bright, kind, and ambitious. She had returned home looking forward to beginning the next chapter of her life. On April 27, 1994, she stopped at a Winn-Dixie supermarket in Lake City. It was an ordinary errand, one she had probably completed dozens of times before. According to prosecutors, Anthony Wainwright and Richard Hamilton had been searching for exactly this kind of opportunity. They needed transportation. They needed money. Most importantly, they needed someone they believed could never identify them. As Carmen reached her vehicle, the 2 escaped prisoners forced her inside at gunpoint. Within seconds, an ordinary grocery trip had become a kidnapping. Authorities later determined that Carmen was driven across northern Florida against her will. For hours, her family had no idea where she was. Investigators would later reconstruct a horrifying timeline through witness statements, forensic evidence, and the suspect's movements after the abduction. According to prosecutors, Carmen was repeatedly assaulted as the fugitives attempted to avoid capture. Eventually, they drove into a secluded wooded area. There, investigators concluded she was murdered. When Carmen failed to return home, concern quickly turned into panic. Family members contacted law enforcement. Friends joined the search. Initially, officers hoped she had simply encountered car trouble. That hope disappeared days later. Search teams located her body in a remote area. The The discovery devastated the entire community. News spread rapidly across Florida. The story was no longer simply about escaped inmates. It had become the story of a young woman whose life ended because two fugitives wanted to remain free. The investigation intensified immediately. Detectives worked alongside state and federal agencies. Every reported sighting of the fugitives was investigated. Vehicles were tracked. Witnesses interviewed. Evidence moved rapidly between laboratories. The manhunt eventually ended hundreds of miles away in Mississippi. Law enforcement officers captured both fugitives after a confrontation, bringing one of the South's largest interstate searches to an end. For Carmen's family, however, the arrest brought only partial relief. The men responsible had been found. Their daughter was still gone. At trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence detailing the kidnapping, sexual assault, robbery, and murder. Forensic specialists explained the physical evidence recovered from multiple locations. Investigators carefully reconstructed the fugitives' route from North Carolina to Florida and ultimately into Mississippi. The defense attempted to shift greater responsibility onto Richard Hamilton, arguing that Wainwright should not bear equal blame for every act committed during the escape. Prosecutors disagreed. They argued that every major decision, from the abduction to the murder, was made together. The jury agreed. Anthony Wainwright was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, robbery, and sexual battery. The sentence was death. Over the next 30 years, his case became another chapter in Florida's lengthy death penalty system. Appeals challenged witness testimony. Attorneys questioned aspects of the trial. Federal courts reviewed constitutional claims. Execution dates came and went. Yet every court ultimately reached the same conclusion. The conviction remained. The sentence remained. As Florida's execution surge accelerated through 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis signed another death warrant. Anthony Wainwright's final legal battle began. Emergency motions reached the Florida Supreme Court. Additional appeals followed in federal court. Every request for a stay was denied. For the second time in his life, Wainwright had run out of places to hide. On June 10, 2025, he spent his final day inside Florida State Prison. He met with attorneys. He spoke privately with a spiritual advisor, while correctional officers quietly prepared the execution chamber for the fifth time that year. Anthony declined a final meal. Outside the prison, reporters assembled once again. Florida's pace of executions was now drawing national attention. As evening approached, Wainwright was escorted into the chamber. Witnesses watched silently through reinforced glass. Before the lethal injection began, he opted for his spiritual advisor to release a statement on his love for his wife and spiritual growth. Moments later, the execution proceeded. At 6:22 p.m., Anthony Wainwright was pronounced dead. Florida had now completed its fifth execution of 2025. For many observers, another decades-old capital case had finally reached its conclusion. For Carmen Gayhart's loved ones, the execution was never about punishment alone. It was about remembering the young woman whose future ended in a supermarket parking lot because two escaped prisoners believed her life was expendable. She had plans. She had dreams. She had only stopped to buy groceries. 31 years later, Florida fulfilled the sentence imposed by the courts. But no sentence could restore the years Carmen never had the chance to live. June 2025. 6 executions completed. Florida's execution chamber had now been used 5 times in less than 4 months. The surge was no longer developing. It was unmistakable. Yet the next death warrant belonged to a man whose victim had never met him before. She walked out of an Orlando nightclub expecting to go home. Instead, investigators would spend weeks hunting a predator who chose complete strangers. Thomas Gudinas, the nightclub predator. Execution date, June 24, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 30 years. State, Florida. For nearly 3 decades, one question continued haunting Michelle McGrath's family. What if she had left the nightclub just 5 minutes earlier? 5 minutes. A different route. A different ride home. A different stranger. Perhaps everything would have changed. But on the morning of May 24, 1994, fate placed Michelle directly in the path of a man prosecutors would later describe as one of Florida's most dangerous sexual predators. By late June 2025, Florida's execution schedule had become impossible to ignore. 6 executions had already been completed. The state's death chamber had become the busiest in America. Another death warrant was now ready to be carried out. Unlike previous executions driven by revenge, domestic violence, or prison escape, this case terrified the public for a completely different reason. The victim had never met her killer. Michelle McGrath was 27 years old. Friends remembered her as confident, outgoing, and full of life. On the evening of May 23rd, she spent time with friends at a popular Orlando nightclub. It wasn't unusual. Thousands of people visited the city's nightlife district every weekend. The atmosphere was loud, crowded, exciting. No one realized a predator was already watching. According to prosecutors, Thomas Gudinas had spent part of the evening moving through the same entertainment district. Witnesses would later recall seeing him near several women before his attention focused on Michelle. As bars began closing during the early morning hours, Michelle walked away alone. It was a decision countless people make every weekend. For Michelle, it became her final walk. Hours later, workers discovered her body in a wooded area not far from where she had last been seen. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been murdered. The brutality shocked even veteran homicide detectives, but another realization frightened investigators even more. This wasn't a domestic homicide. It wasn't a robbery. The victim appeared to have been chosen at random, which raised a terrifying possibility. If the killer had selected one stranger, could he simply choose another? The investigation immediately became one of Orlando's highest priorities. Crime scene technicians worked meticulously through every inch of the area where Michelle's body had been found. Forensic specialists recovered biological evidence. Investigators interviewed nightclub employees, taxi drivers, nearby residents, and dozens of patrons who had crossed paths with Michelle during her final hours. Detectives reconstructed her movements almost minute by minute. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Several witnesses independently described the same man lingering near Michelle shortly before she disappeared. None of them knew his name, but each description pointed investigators in the same direction: Thomas Gudinas. As detectives examined Gudinas's background, they discovered a history of violent behavior and previous sexual offenses. The investigation intensified. Physical evidence recovered during the forensic examination strengthened the case considerably. Combined with eyewitness testimony and Gudinas's movements that evening, prosecutors believed they had enough to bring capital murder charges. His arrest brought relief across Central Florida. For weeks, many women had wondered whether another predator was waiting outside Orlando's nightclubs. Now investigators believed that threat had finally been removed. At trial, prosecutors carefully reconstructed Michelle's final hours. Witnesses described seeing Gudinas following her after she left the nightclub. Forensic experts explained how biological evidence connected him directly to the crime. Medical examiners detailed the violence Michelle endured. The courtroom often fell silent. The defense challenged portions of the forensic evidence and questioned aspects of witness identification. They argued the state's case contained weaknesses that should prevent a death sentence. Prosecutors disagreed. When every piece of evidence was viewed together, they argued only one conclusion remained. Thomas Gudinas murdered Michelle McGrath. After deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict. The sentence was death. For the next 30 years, Gudinas became another inmate inside Florida's growing death row population. Appeals followed. Attorneys challenged forensic procedures. Higher courts reviewed constitutional claims. Execution dates were postponed. Legal arguments changed. The outcome never did. Every major court upheld both the conviction and the sentence. Meanwhile, Michelle's family continued living without birthdays, without holidays together, without the future she should have had. As June 2025 drew to a close, Florida's execution surge entered another phase. Governor Ron DeSantis signed yet another death warrant. The legal battle that had lasted nearly 3 decades was almost over. Gudinas' attorneys filed emergency appeals with both state and federal courts. Each was denied. The execution would proceed. On June 24, 2025, Thomas Gudinas spent his final day inside Florida State Prison. He met privately with legal counsel. He received visits from a spiritual advisor. He was served his final meal, pepperoni pizza, French fries, and soda, while correctional officers prepared the execution chamber for the 7th time that year. Outside the prison, journalists gathered once again. National attention had shifted toward Florida. The state was carrying out executions at a pace unmatched anywhere else in the country. As evening approached, Gudinas entered the chamber. Witnesses watched through reinforced glass. Before the lethal injection began, he made an inaudible final statement. Moments later, the procedure commenced. At 6:13 p.m., Thomas Gudinas was pronounced dead. Florida had now completed 7 executions in 2025. For many observers, another notorious capital case had reached its conclusion. For Michelle McGrath's loved ones, the execution could never erase one simple truth. She wasn't targeted because of who she was. She was targeted because she happened to be alone. A daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman whose final night out became one of Orlando's darkest homicide investigations. 31 years later, justice arrived. But it arrived decades after the life that mattered most had already been taken. June 2025, 7 executions completed. Halfway through the year, Florida had already carried out 6 executions. The pace was accelerating. Yet the next death warrant belonged to a man whose motive wasn't opportunity. It was revenge. He believed he was hunting his brother's killer. Instead, 2 completely innocent people died, and one mistake would send him to death row for the next 3 decades. Michael Bell. The revenge misfire execution date, July 15, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 30 years, state Florida. The death warrant wasn't signed because Michael Bell had planned the perfect murder. It was signed because revenge had destroyed the wrong lives. By the summer of 2025, Florida's execution chamber had already been used 6 times. Each execution told a different story: a family annihilator, a serial predator, an escaped convict, a tourist killer. Now came something entirely different: a man who believed he was delivering justice himself. Instead, prosecutors argued he became the very thing he claimed to hate. For more than 30 years, Michael Bell lived with one haunting reality: the 2 people he killed were never supposed to die. Long before Bell entered Florida's execution chamber, tragedy had already struck his family. His brother had been murdered. The loss devastated him. Friends later described a man consumed by grief, but grief slowly gave way to something far more dangerous: obsession. According to prosecutors, Bell became convinced he knew exactly who was responsible. He no longer trusted the justice system to deliver accountability. He decided he would. Investigators later concluded that Bell spent days searching for the people he believed had murdered his brother. His anger grew stronger, his patience disappeared. Eventually, he believed he had found them. On December 9, 1993, Bell armed himself and drove through Jacksonville looking for revenge. When he spotted a vehicle he believed belonged to his target, he didn't hesitate. According to prosecutors, Bell pulled alongside the car and opened fire. The shooting lasted only seconds. When it ended, 2 people were dead: Jimmy West, Tameka Smith. Neither had murdered Bell's brother, and neither had anything to do with the crime. They were innocent. Investigators would later describe the case as one of Florida's most devastating mistaken identity revenge killings. The man Bell wanted wasn't even inside the vehicle. He had unleashed his anger on the wrong people. Within minutes, detectives arrived to find a crime scene filled with shell casings, shattered glass, and unanswered questions. Why these victims? What connection did they have to Bell? The answer stunned investigators. There wasn't one. The investigation moved quickly. Witnesses described the gunfire. Crime scene specialists analyzed bullet trajectories. Ballistics experts linked the weapon used in the attack. As detectives reconstructed Bell's movements before the shooting, one conclusion became increasingly difficult to ignore: the murders hadn't happened during an argument. They hadn't happened during a robbery. They were part of a revenge plan. Only the intended targets were wrong. Bell was arrested. For Jimmy West's and Tameka Smith's families, the arrests brought relief. But relief could never become healing. Their loved ones had died for someone else's mistake. The trial forced jurors to confront a difficult reality. Grief can explain emotion. It cannot excuse murder. Prosecutors carefully reconstructed Bell's investigation into his brother's death, demonstrating how assumptions gradually replaced facts. They argued that Bell never verified whether the people inside the vehicle were actually responsible. He simply decided they were. The defense presented testimony describing Bell's emotional collapse after losing his brother. Attorneys argued he had acted while overwhelmed by trauma and anger, but prosecutors reminded jurors that Jimmy West and Tameka Smith never received the opportunity to defend themselves. The jury agreed. Michael Bell was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. For the next 3 decades, Bell remained on Florida's death row while attorneys challenged nearly every aspect of his conviction. Appeals questioned jury instructions. Constitutional arguments reached state and federal courts. Execution dates came and went. The victims' families continued waiting. Then came 2025. Governor Ron DeSantis signed another warrant. For Bell's attorneys, the legal battle entered its final hours. Emergency petitions reached the Florida Supreme Court. Federal courts reviewed additional filings. Each request was denied. The sentence would stand. On July 15, 2025, Michael Bell spent his final day inside Florida State Prison. He met privately with attorneys. He spoke with spiritual advisors. He received his final meal, an omelet, bacon, home fries, and orange juice, while correctional officers prepared the execution chamber for the 8th time that year. Outside the prison, reporters once again gathered beneath Florida's summer sky. The state had become the center of America's death penalty debate. As evening approached, Bell entered the chamber. Witnesses watched quietly through reinforced glass. Before the execution began, Bell's final words were, "Thank you for not letting me spend the rest of my life in prison." Moments later, the lethal injection proceeded. At 6:25 p.m., Michael Bell was pronounced dead. Florida had now completed 8 executions in 2025. For many observers, another decades-old capital case had reached its legal conclusion. For Jimmy West's and Tameka Smith's families, however, the execution represented something far more personal. Their loved ones weren't caught in gang violence. They weren't involved in a criminal dispute. They simply occupied the wrong car at the wrong time. Sometimes revenge doesn't find its intended target. Sometimes it creates entirely new victims. 3 decades later, Florida carried out the sentence, but the 2 innocent lives taken in a single burst of gunfire remained the greatest tragedy of all. July 2025, 8 executions completed. 8 executions, 8 death warrants fulfilled. Florida's pace showed no signs of slowing, yet the next chapter would break from everything that came before. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about strangers. It wasn't about an escape. It was about a respected Air Force sergeant, a collapsing marriage, and a family that disappeared inside their own home, setting the stage for one of Florida's most haunting familicide cases. Edward Zakrzewski II, the Family Annihilator Execution Date, July 31st, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 30 years, state, Florida. Neighbors remembered the family as quiet. The children played outside. The parents attended school events. Edward Zakrzewski wore the uniform of a United States Air Force technical sergeant stationed at Eglin Air Force Base. From the street, they looked like an ordinary American family. No one imagined they were living through the final days of a marriage that would soon become one of Florida's most disturbing familicides. By late July 2025, Florida had already carried out 8 executions. The death chamber had become a recurring destination for inmates whose crimes dated back decades. Yet, this execution was different. Unlike the previous episode, there was no act of revenge. No stranger lurking outside a nightclub, no escaped prisoner. This story began inside a family home. It began with divorce. In the spring of 1994, Sylvia Zakrzewski reached a decision. She wanted to end her marriage. According to testimony presented during trial, she believed the relationship could not be repaired. Friends later recalled growing tension between the couple. Arguments became increasingly common. The future they had once planned together was quietly collapsing. Investigators later uncovered testimony that Edward Zakrzewski had made deeply disturbing remarks before the murders. According to witnesses, he suggested he would rather kill his family than allow the marriage to end. At the time, few imagined those words would become evidence in a future capital murder trial. On June 9, 1994, Zakrzewski learned Sylvia intended to proceed with the divorce. During his lunch break, prosecutors said he drove to a hardware store. He purchased a machete. That purchase would later become one of the prosecution's strongest indicators of premeditation. When he returned home, investigators believe he waited. Hours later, Sylvia arrived. According to prosecutors, she was attacked almost immediately. Evidence presented at trial showed she was struck with a crowbar before being strangled. Believing she might still be alive, prosecutors argued Zakrzewski then used the machete. The violence did not stop there. 7-year-old Edward, known to family as Kim, was called into the bathroom. Instead of finding his parents, he encountered his father. Moments later, he too was killed. Then came 5-year-old Anna. She was the last member of the family to enter the room. She never walked back out. When investigators later examined the children's injuries, they documented defensive wounds. Evidence prosecutors argued showed they tried desperately to protect themselves. By nightfall, an entire family had been wiped out. Only one person remained alive, Edward Zakrzewski. But instead of contacting police, prosecutors said he fled Florida. The murders immediately triggered one of the state's most heavily publicized manhunts. Detectives processed the home while agents from multiple jurisdictions searched for the missing Air Force sergeant. Television stations aired his photograph. Newspapers published his name. Weeks passed, then months. The search eventually stretched nearly 5,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean. Investigators learned Zakrzewski had traveled to Hawaii, where he was living quietly under his own name within a religious community. Ironically, the breakthrough didn't come from police work alone. It came from television. After Unsolved Mysteries featured the case nationally, a minister recognized Zakrzewski from the broadcast. Instead of helping him hide, the minister urged him to surrender. The following day, Zakrzewski walked into a local police station. The nationwide manhunt was over. The trial that followed focused heavily on one central issue: planning. Prosecutors argued the murders were calculated long before they occurred. The purchase of the machete, the concealed weapons, the sequence of the attacks, the flight to Hawaii. Together, they argued, painted the picture of a man who deliberately eliminated his entire family rather than face divorce. The defense acknowledged the killings but urged jurors to consider Zakrzewski's emotional state. Attorneys argued that overwhelming personal stress, depression, and fear surrounding the collapse of his marriage had profoundly affected his judgment. Jurors listened carefully. Then they returned with 3 guilty verdicts. Edward Zakrzewski received 3 death sentences. For the next 3 decades, his case wound through Florida's appellate system. Appeals challenged sentencing procedures. Mental health evidence was reviewed. Federal courts examined constitutional claims. Every significant review reached the same conclusion. The convictions remained. The sentences remained. As July 2025 came to an end, Governor Ron DeSantis signed another warrant. The execution would become Florida's 8th of the year. Zakrzewski's attorneys filed emergency motions in both state and federal courts. The requests were denied. The legal process that had stretched across 31 years had finally reached its conclusion. On July 31, 2025, Edward Zakrzewski spent his final day inside Florida State Prison. He met privately with attorneys. He received visits from spiritual advisors. He was served his final meal: fried pork chops, fried onions, potatoes, bacon, buttered toast, root beer, ice cream, pie, and coffee, while correctional officers prepared the execution chamber once again. Outside, reporters gathered beneath the summer heat. Florida's execution surge had become national news. As evening approached, Zakrzewski entered the chamber. Witnesses took their seats behind reinforced glass. Before the execution began, he delivered a final statement that drew national attention. "I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold, calculated, clean, humane, efficient way possible. I have no complaints." Moments later, the lethal injection began. At 6:12 p.m., Edward Zakrzewski II was pronounced dead. Florida had now completed 9 executions in 2025. For many observers, another decades-old capital case had finally reached its legal conclusion. For Sylvia's loved ones, however, no legal process could erase what happened inside that family home. A mother, a 7-year-old boy, a 5-year-old girl. 3 lives ended not because of strangers, not because of robbery, not because of revenge, but because the person they trusted most decided no one would leave the marriage alive. July 2025. 9 executions completed. 9 executions. 9 decades-old cases finally closed. Florida's pace had become unprecedented. But the next death warrant would introduce a case the nation had never heard before. The next story wouldn't begin with an execution. It would begin with a child waiting for someone who would never come home. Cale Bates. The insurance office abduction execution date, August 19, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 42 years, state, Florida. Some crimes disappear from the headlines within days, others remain frozen in time. Not because people refuse to move on, but because the brutality of what happened never allows them to. By August 2025, Florida's execution surge had reached an extraordinary milestone. 9 executions had already been carried out. The next inmate had spent more than 4 decades waiting on death row. His execution would become Florida's 10th of the year, breaking the state's modern execution record. But long before Cale Bates became part of that record, a 24-year-old woman named Janet Renee White was simply going to work. She worked at a State Farm insurance office in Lynn Haven, a quiet community in Florida's Panhandle. Friends knew her as Renee. She had recently married. She was building a future with her husband, Randy. Like every ordinary workday, customers came and went. Telephones rang, paperwork accumulated. Nothing suggested that June 14, 1982 would become her final day alive. According to prosecutors, Cale Bates had already decided where he was going. Investigators later concluded that he entered the insurance office armed with a handgun and looking for a victim. When the opportunity presented itself, he forced Janet from her workplace at gunpoint. Co-workers watched helplessly. Within moments, both the young woman and her abductor were gone. The kidnapping triggered immediate alarm. Law enforcement agencies throughout Bay County mobilized. Roadblocks were established. Officers searched highways, wooded areas, and abandoned roads. For Janet's husband, every passing hour deepened the fear that something unimaginable had happened. Investigators would later reconstruct the terrifying sequence of events. According to the prosecution, Bates drove Janet to a remote wooded area outside Lynn Haven. There, he robbed her, attempted to sexually assault her, and fatally stabbed her. Before fleeing, prosecutors said he removed the diamond ring from her finger. The violence shocked the entire community. A young woman had been abducted from her workplace in broad daylight. Residents wondered how something so horrific could happen inside a quiet Florida town. Fortunately, the investigation moved quickly. Officers responding to the area located Bates only a short distance from the crime scene. According to court records, he still possessed incriminating evidence, including Janet's wedding ring, and investigators recovered physical evidence linking him directly to the abduction and murder. Authorities also testified that Bates made admissions connecting himself to the crime. For detectives, the case had come together with unusual speed, but speed could never lessen the tragedy. Janet White was gone. Her husband had lost his wife. 2 families had been shattered in a single afternoon. The trial began the following year. Prosecutors carefully walked jurors through the kidnapping, robbery, attempted sexual battery, and murder. Forensic experts explained the physical evidence recovered after Bates's arrest. Witnesses described the terrifying moments inside the insurance office. The prosecution argued that the crime demonstrated planning, violence, and complete disregard for human life. The defense challenged aspects of the state's case and later pursued years of post-conviction litigation, raising issues that included DNA testing, jury composition, and sentencing procedures. Those arguments would continue for decades. The jury nevertheless found Bates guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, and attempted sexual battery. The sentence was death. What followed became one of the longest death row journeys in Florida history. Years turned into decades. Governors changed, judges retired, Entire generations grew up knowing the case only through court records. Appeals repeatedly reached state and federal courts. Several legal developments required additional sentencing proceedings before the death sentence was ultimately reaffirmed. Even in the final months before the execution, Bates's attorneys continued challenging the conviction and sentence, arguing that unresolved legal and constitutional issues remained. The courts disagreed. By the summer of 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis signed another death warrant. Florida was preparing to carry out its 10th execution of the year. Emergency appeals reached the Florida Supreme Court. Additional requests followed in the federal courts. Each was denied. The execution would proceed. On August 19, 2025, Cale Bates spent his final day inside Florida State Prison. He met with attorneys. He received visits from spiritual advisors. Shortly before the execution, prison officials asked whether he wished to make a final statement. He answered with a single word: no. Minutes later, the lethal injection began. At 6:17 p.m., Cale Bates was pronounced dead, becoming Florida's 10th execution of 2025 and establishing a new state record for executions in a single year. For many observers, the execution marked another milestone in Florida's unprecedented use of capital punishment. For Randy White, who witnessed the execution after promising his wife decades earlier that he would see the case through, it marked the end of a 43-year pursuit of justice. But no execution could restore the future Janet White lost: a young wife, a daughter, a co-worker who left her desk expecting to finish another workday. Instead, she became the victim whose case would remain on Florida's death row longer than many people spend raising an entire family. 42 years after the murder, the legal process finally came to an end. For those who loved Janet, the loss never did. August 2025. 10 executions completed. Florida had reached a historic milestone. 10 executions, a new state record, yet the surge was only accelerating. Just 9 days later, another death warrant would be carried out, this time involving a triple murder that had haunted Central Florida for more than 3 decades. Curtis Wyndham, the triple revenge murders execution date, August 28, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 33 years state, Florida. 3 gunshots would have been horrifying enough, but that wasn't where the violence ended. By the time detectives finished reconstructing Curtis Wyndham's movements, they realized they weren't investigating one homicide, or even 2. They were investigating a chain of revenge killings that unfolded across Orange County within a matter of hours. By late August 2025, Florida's execution surge had reached historic proportions. 10 executions had already been carried out. Just 9 days earlier, Florida had broken its modern-era record by executing Cale Bates. Now another death warrant waited, the 11th of the year. The pace was no longer merely unusual, it had become unprecedented. The story began on February 7, 1992. According to prosecutors, Curtis Wyndham believed a man named Johnny Lee owed him approximately $2,000. Earlier that day, Wyndham learned Lee had won a modest amount of money at a Greyhound racetrack. Instead of letting the debt go, investigators said Wyndham made a chilling prediction to an acquaintance. "You're going to read about me." He then purchased a .38 caliber revolver and ammunition. Prosecutors argued that the purchase marked the beginning of a deliberate plan, not a spontaneous confrontation. Later that day, Wyndham found Lee. Court records showed he pulled alongside him in a vehicle and opened fire. Lee was struck from behind. As he lay wounded on the ground, prosecutors said Wyndham stepped out of his car and fired additional shots at close range. Johnny Lee died where he fell, but investigators quickly discovered that Lee had not been Wyndham's final target. After leaving the first crime scene, Wyndham drove to the apartment of his girlfriend, Valerie Davis. Instead of finding safety there, Valerie became the second victim. According to prosecutors, Wyndham fatally shot her inside the apartment. The violence still wasn't over. When Valerie's mother, Mary Lubin, learned her daughter had been shot, she immediately left work and drove toward the apartment. She never made it. As Lubin slowed at a stop sign, prosecutors said Wyndham intercepted her vehicle and opened fire. She died before help could arrive. Within a single afternoon, 3 separate murder scenes stretched across the Orlando area. Detectives initially wondered whether they were investigating unrelated shootings. Ballistics evidence quickly changed that. The same weapon connected every scene. Witnesses began describing the same suspect. As investigators traced Wyndham's movements throughout the day, the timeline became impossible to ignore. The shootings weren't random. They were connected by anger, revenge, and escalating violence. Wyndham was arrested shortly afterward. For the victims' families, the case became almost impossible to comprehend. Johnny Lee had allegedly been targeted over money. Valerie Davis lost her life because of her relationship with Wyndham. Mary Lubin died simply because she rushed to help her daughter. 3 victims, 3 grieving families. One afternoon that permanently altered countless lives. At trial, prosecutors reconstructed the killings minute by minute. Jurors heard testimony describing the purchase of the firearm, the confrontation with Lee, the shootings that followed, and the forensic evidence linking every crime scene together. The prosecution argued that Wyndham's actions reflected planning, deliberation, and a willingness to eliminate anyone who stood in his path. The defense later argued that Wyndham had received ineffective legal representation during his capital trial and raised numerous constitutional challenges throughout decades of post-conviction litigation. Those arguments continued through state and federal courts for more than 30 years. The conviction never changed. Neither did the sentence. By the summer of 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis signed another death warrant. Curtis Wyndham became the next inmate scheduled for execution. His attorneys filed emergency appeals with both the Florida Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court, arguing that serious deficiencies during the original trial required intervention. The courts declined. The execution would proceed. On August 28, 2025, Wyndham spent his final day inside Florida State Prison. He met with attorneys. He received visits from spiritual advisors. Outside the prison, journalists gathered once again as Florida prepared to carry out yet another execution during its extraordinary year. As evening approached, correctional officers escorted Wyndham into the execution chamber. Witnesses took their seats behind reinforced glass. Before the procedure began, Wyndham attempted to speak, but witnesses reported that his final words were largely unintelligible. Moments later, the lethal injection commenced. At 6:17 p.m., Curtis Wyndham was pronounced dead. Florida had now completed 11 executions in 2025, extending a record-setting pace unmatched in the state's modern era. For many observers, another decades-old capital case had finally reached its legal conclusion. For the families of Johnny Lee, Valerie Davis, and Mary Lubin, however, the execution could never restore the lives stolen on that February day. A debt, a relationship, a mother's desperate attempt to reach her daughter, 3 different stories, one devastating ending. The courts closed the case. Time never closed the loss. August 2025, 11 executions completed. 11 executions. Florida's pace was accelerating instead of slowing. Autumn was approaching. Another warrant had already been signed. The next case would return investigators to a family home, where a domestic dispute escalated into multiple murders, setting the stage for Florida's 12th execution of an unprecedented year. David Pittman. The divorce triple murder execution date, September 17, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 34 years state, Florida. Firefighters expected to save lives. That morning, they were trying to preserve a crime scene. Smoke poured through the windows of a modest home in Polk County as firefighters forced their way inside. What they found wasn't simply the aftermath of a house fire, it was evidence of something far more deliberate. 3 members of the same family had been murdered. The fire, investigators believed, wasn't the crime. It was an attempt to erase it. By September 2025, Florida's execution surge had entered another phase. 11 executions had already been carried out. The state had shattered its previous modern record, and another death warrant was waiting to be fulfilled. This time, it belonged to David Pittman. Unlike the previous episode, this story didn't begin with strangers. It began with a marriage falling apart. According to prosecutors, David Pittman and his wife were in the middle of a bitter separation in 1990. Emotions had escalated. Relationships between Pittman and his wife's family had deteriorated. What followed, investigators said, wasn't a crime of sudden passion. It was a calculated act of retaliation. On May 13, 1990, prosecutors argued that Pittman entered the Mulberry home of his estranged wife's parents. Inside were three people: Clarence Knowles, age 60, Barbara Knowles, age 50, and their 21-year-old daughter, Bonnie Knowles. According to trial testimony, all three were fatally stabbed. Investigators later concluded the attack didn't end there. The house was deliberately set on fire. Bonnie's car was stolen and later burned in another attempt to destroy evidence and delay investigators from uncovering what had happened. But fire has limits. When firefighters extinguished the flames, detectives began noticing evidence that didn't match an accidental blaze. The victim's injuries, the burn patterns, the condition of the home, everything suggested the fire had been started after the killings. The investigation quickly shifted from arson to triple homicide. Detectives interviewed neighbors. Witnesses described seeing Pittman near the property. Investigators reconstructed his movements before and after the fire. Additional testimony, including evidence presented by eyewitnesses and later a jailhouse informant, became part of the prosecution's case. As the evidence accumulated, prosecutors argued that the murders were driven by resentment toward Pittman's estranged wife's family during the divorce. He was arrested and charged. For surviving relatives, the arrests marked only the beginning. The trial forced them to relive every detail. Jurors heard testimony describing the fatal stabbings, the arson, and the theft of Bonnie's vehicle. Crime scene experts explained how investigators concluded the fire had been intentionally set to conceal the murders. The prosecution argued that the evidence pointed consistently toward one man. The defense maintained Pittman's innocence and challenged key portions of the state's case. After deliberation, the jury convicted David Pittman of 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with arson and grand theft. The sentence was death. The years that followed became another familiar chapter in Florida's capital punishment system. Appeals moved through state courts. Federal judges reviewed constitutional claims. Execution dates came and went. One issue increasingly dominated the later litigation. Pittman's attorneys argued that he had an intellectual disability that should make him ineligible for execution under constitutional standards. State prosecutors disagreed, arguing the claim had been raised too late under Florida law. The courts ultimately declined to halt the execution. By the summer of 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis signed another death warrant. Florida prepared for its 12th execution of the year. Emergency appeals reached both the Florida Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court. Each request failed. The sentence would be carried out. On September 17, 2025, David Pittman spent his final day inside Florida State Prison. He met with legal counsel. He received a final visitor. Outside the prison, reporters assembled once again as Florida continued its record-breaking year of executions. As evening approached, Pittman entered the execution chamber. Witnesses watched silently from behind reinforced glass. Before the lethal injection began, Pittman rejected the verdict that had defined the last 3 decades of his life. "I know you all came to watch an innocent man be murdered by the state of Florida. I am innocent. I didn't kill anybody. That's it." Moments later, the execution proceeded. At 6:12 p.m., David Pittman was pronounced dead. Florida had now carried out 12 executions in 2025, the highest annual total since the state reinstated capital punishment after the 1970s. For the justice system, another decades-old capital case had reached its conclusion. For the Knowles family, however, the execution could never erase what happened inside that home. A husband, a wife, a daughter. 3 lives ended, 1 house reduced to ashes, and a family forever divided by a crime that began with divorce but ended in murder. September 2025, 12 executions completed. Florida's execution surge showed no sign of slowing. Just 13 days later, another inmate would enter the same chamber. This time, investigators would revisit a double homicide that remained unsolved until one crucial witness shattered the silence, and Florida prepared to carry out its 13th execution of an extraordinary year. Victor Tony Jones, the medical supply double murder execution date, September 30th, 2025, time on death row, approximately 32 years, state, Florida. Some crimes are solved within hours. That doesn't make them any less devastating. For Matilda and Jacob Nestor, an ordinary workday inside the family business ended in unimaginable violence. By the time investigators arrived, the evidence told a story almost too shocking to believe. The husband had managed to fight back, but even that wasn't enough to save either of them. By the end of September 2025, Florida's execution surge had become the defining death penalty story in America. 12 executions had already been carried out. Another death warrant had now reached its final hours. Unlike many of the earlier cases in this documentary, detectives didn't spend years searching for the killer. They found him almost immediately. The challenge wasn't identifying the suspect. It was understanding why two respected business owners had been murdered inside their own workplace. On December 4th, 1990, Matilda, Dolly, and Jacob, Jack, Nestor opened their Miami-Dade medical supply business like any other morning. The couple had built the company together through years of hard work. Employees described them as generous employers, trusted members of the community. Only recently, they had hired a new worker. His name was Victor Tony Jones. According to prosecutors, what happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Authorities said Jones attacked Matilda first, stabbing her in the neck. Jacob rushed to help his wife. He too was stabbed, this time in the chest. Despite suffering a fatal wound, Jacob managed to do something investigators would later describe as extraordinary. He reached a nearby office, retrieved a .22 caliber pistol, and fired at his attacker. One bullet struck Jones in the forehead. The injury didn't stop him. According to prosecutors, Jones fled with cash, wallets, keys, and other belongings taken from the victims. Emergency responders arrived to find both Matilda and Jacob fatally wounded. Neither survived. But Jacob's final act of resistance had changed the investigation forever. Detectives searching the area soon located a wounded man with a gunshot injury to his forehead. That man was Victor Jones. When officers searched him, they recovered property belonging to the Nestors. Investigators later testified that Jones admitted killing the couple because he believed they owed him money. For detectives, the case came together with unusual speed. The physical evidence, the recovered property, the gunshot wound, the admissions. Together, they formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. At trial, prosecutors argued that Jones had committed a robbery that escalated into a double murder. Jurors heard testimony describing the attacks inside the business and Jacob Nestor's desperate attempt to defend himself and his wife despite suffering a mortal wound. The defense challenged the prosecution's case and, over the following decades, raised numerous issues during post-conviction proceedings. Among the most significant were claims that Jones had an intellectual disability and that severe abuse he endured as a child in the notorious Okeechobee School for Boys should have been presented more fully as mitigating evidence. Earlier in 2025, Florida had formally recognized Jones as a survivor of abuse at the institution through the state's compensation program, a fact his attorneys argued should weigh against execution. The courts reviewed those arguments. Ultimately, they concluded the conviction and death sentence would stand. For more than 3 decades, Victor Jones remained on Florida's death row. Appeals moved through state courts. Federal judges reviewed constitutional challenges. Execution dates were postponed. Legal standards evolved. The sentence remained unchanged. Then, in 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis signed another death warrant. Florida prepared for its 13th execution of the year. Emergency appeals once again reached both the Florida Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court. Neither court intervened. The execution would proceed. On September 30th, 2025, Victor Jones spent his final day inside Florida State Prison. He met with a spiritual advisor. He received his final meal: fried chicken, collard greens, and sweet tea. When asked whether he wished to make a final statement, his answer was brief: "No, sir." Moments later, the lethal injection began. At 6:13 p.m., Victor Tony Jones was pronounced dead. Florida had now carried out 13 executions in 2025, extending an annual record unlike any in the state's modern history. For many observers, the case also reignited debate about intellectual disability, childhood abuse, and the limits of mitigation in capital punishment. For Irene Fisher and the rest of the Nestor family, however, the case had always been about something much simpler: a husband who refused to abandon his wife, a wife who never walked out of the business they had built together. Two lives ended in a place that represented decades of hard work. Jacob's final act of courage became part of Florida criminal history. It wasn't enough to save him, but it helped ensure the investigation would never become a mystery. September 2025. 13 executions completed. 13 executions. Florida's unprecedented year continued. October was only days away. Another death warrant had already been signed. The next case would take investigators back to rural Hillsborough County, where two women disappeared separately before detectives uncovered a killer whose crimes remained hidden beneath the surface for years. Samuel Lee Smithers. The Deacon of Death execution. Date: October 14th, 2025. Time on death row: approximately 26 years. State: Florida. People trusted him. On Sundays, they called him Deacon. He attended church. He worked hard. He blended into the community so completely that almost no one imagined investigators would one day accuse him of becoming a serial killer. By October 2025, Florida's execution surge had reached unprecedented territory. 13 executions had already been carried out. The state was executing inmates at a pace unseen since the restoration of capital punishment. Yet, the next death warrant belonged to a man whose public image made the case especially disturbing. Because according to prosecutors, Samuel Lee Smithers didn't hunt strangers in dark alleys. He hid behind respectability. The victims were Denise Roach and Christy Cowan. Both women struggled with addiction. Both occasionally engaged in sex work to survive. Both were someone's daughter. One was a mother. The other had once dreamed of becoming a nurse before addiction derailed her future. In May 1996, investigators believe Smithers met Denise Roach at a Tampa motel. According to prosecutors, he paid for sex before persuading her to accompany him to a rural property in Plant City, where he occasionally worked. She never returned. More than 2 weeks later, another woman disappeared. Her name was Christy Cowan. Prosecutors said Smithers used the same approach. Another meeting, another isolated property, another woman who vanished without explanation. At first, no one knew the cases were connected. Missing persons reports arrived separately. Friends searched, families waited, detectives had little to work with. Then an observant property owner noticed something deeply unsettling. Investigators later testified that bloodstains had appeared around the property, and Smithers had been seen cleaning tools and behaving suspiciously. The discovery prompted a closer examination. What detectives uncovered next transformed the investigation. Human remains were recovered from a nearby pond. Then another body. The two missing women had been found in the same secluded location. The investigation intensified immediately. Crime scene technicians searched the property inch by inch. Forensic specialists examined tools, vehicles, and biological evidence. As the evidence mounted, detectives focused on Samuel Lee Smithers. During questioning, he offered varying accounts of what had happened. Prosecutors argued those explanations were attempts to minimize responsibility rather than truthful descriptions of the killings. The physical evidence told a different story. Investigators concluded both women had been killed before their bodies were dumped in the pond. The prosecution argued that Smithers deliberately exploited vulnerable victims he believed would not immediately draw public attention. Instead, their disappearances became the beginning of one of Hillsborough County's most disturbing homicide investigations. The trial began in 1999. Jurors heard testimony describing the two murders, the recovery of the bodies, and the forensic evidence linking Smithers to both crimes. The prosecution portrayed a calculated predator who repeatedly targeted women in desperate circumstances. The defense challenged portions of the state's evidence and disputed aspects of the prosecution's timeline. After weeks of testimony, the jury convicted Smithers on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. For more than a quarter century, Smithers remained on Florida's death row. Appeals reached the Florida Supreme Court, Federal courts reviewed constitutional claims. As he grew older, his attorneys advanced a different argument. By 2025, Smithers was 72 years old. They argued that executing someone of his age and declining health would violate constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Florida's courts rejected those claims, finding no legal precedent that categorically exempted elderly inmates from execution. The United States Supreme Court also declined to intervene. Governor Ron DeSantis signed another death warrant. Florida prepared for its 14th execution of the year. On October 14, 2025, Samuel Lee Smithers spent his final day inside Florida State Prison. He met with spiritual advisors. As evening approached, correctional officers escorted him into the execution chamber. Witnesses took their seats behind reinforced glass. When the warden asked whether he wished to make a final statement, Smithers quietly answered, "No, sir." The lethal injection began almost immediately. At 6:15 p.m., Samuel Lee Smithers was pronounced dead. Florida had now completed 14 executions in 2025, another record. Another decades-old case brought to its legal conclusion. For many observers, the execution was notable because Smithers, at 72, was among the oldest inmates executed in modern Florida history. For the families of Denise Roach and Christy Cowan, however, age was never the story. They remembered two women whose lives had value long before they were reduced to headlines. Two daughters, two mothers, two human beings whose struggles did not diminish their worth. Their names deserve to be remembered for more than the circumstances of their deaths. Nearly 3 decades after they disappeared, Florida carried out the sentence imposed for their murders. Justice arrived, but far too late to give either woman the future she had lost. October 2025, 14 executions completed. 14 executions. Florida's pace continued to outdistance every other state. Yet the next warrant would involve a man convicted of murdering a child inside her own bedroom. If you are still watching to this point, consider subscribing to The Night Hour because as autumn deepened, the surge entered one of its most emotionally devastating chapters. Norman Merle Grimm, Jr. The neighbor's secret execution date, October 28, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 25 years state, Florida. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a scream. It wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't even a missing person report. It was a broken window. Around 5 o'clock on the morning of July 27, 1998, 41-year-old attorney Cynthia Campbell called law enforcement after someone threw a lug nut through a window of her home in East Milton, Florida. Her next-door neighbor walked over to check on her. His name was Norman Merle Grimm, Jr. To investigators, it looked like nothing more than a strange act of vandalism. By the end of the day, it would become the opening chapter of one of the Florida Panhandle's most disturbing murder cases. By late October 2025, Florida's execution surge had reached extraordinary levels. 14 executions had already been carried out. The state had executed more inmates that year than at any point since the modern death penalty era began. Another death warrant was now ready to be fulfilled. Unlike the previous episode, detectives weren't searching for a serial predator. They weren't investigating a robbery. They were trying to understand how a trusted neighbor became the prime suspect. After police left Cynthia's home that morning, she accepted Grimm's invitation for a cup of coffee at his nearby residence. It wasn't unusual. The two lived next door to one another. Neighbors often spoke. Neighbors often helped one another. That ordinary act of trust would be the last confirmed sighting of Cynthia Campbell alive. A short time later, one of Cynthia's employees arrived at the house before work. The front door stood open. Lights were still on, but Cynthia was gone. Her vehicle remained. Her personal belongings were untouched. The scene immediately felt wrong. Family members couldn't reach her. Co-workers grew increasingly concerned. What began as a missing person investigation quickly expanded across Santa Rosa County. Days later, a fisherman made a horrifying discovery near the Pensacola Bay Bridge. Floating in the water was the body of Cynthia Campbell. The medical examiner's findings shocked even experienced investigators. She had suffered repeated blunt force injuries to the face and head, consistent with being struck by a hammer. She had also sustained 11 stab wounds to the chest. 7 had penetrated her heart. The brutality left little doubt. This had been an intensely violent homicide. Detectives retraced Cynthia's final known movements. Every timeline returned to the same place, her next-door neighbor, Norman Grimm. Crime scene technicians collected biological evidence. Forensic scientists analyzed DNA recovered during the investigation. The results became one of the prosecution's strongest pieces of evidence. According to prosecutors, the physical evidence placed Grimm directly at the center of the crime. As detectives continued building the case, they also examined Cynthia's professional life. She had worked as an attorney handling civil litigation and had previously received threats connected to some of her legal work. The defense later argued investigators focused too quickly on Grimm and failed to adequately pursue alternative suspects. Those arguments would continue through years of appeals. The jury, however, reached a different conclusion. During trial in 2000, prosecutors carefully reconstructed the timeline from the broken window before dawn to the recovery of Cynthia's body days later. DNA evidence, witness testimony, forensic analysis. Together, they formed the backbone of the state's case. Jurors convicted Norman Merrill Grimm Jr. of first-degree murder and sexual battery. The sentence was death. What followed made the case unusual. Unlike many death row inmates who fought every stage of the appellate process, Grimm repeatedly expressed that he preferred execution over spending the remainder of his life in prison. Years earlier, he had even instructed his lawyers not to present mitigating evidence during sentencing. As 2025 approached, he took another extraordinary step. He waived his final appeals altogether. The decision dramatically shortened the final legal chapter of a case that had already lasted a quarter century. Governor Ron DeSantis signed another death warrant. Florida prepared for its 15th execution of the year. On October 28, 2025, Grimm received no visitors. He declined to meet with a spiritual advisor. He was escorted into the execution chamber shortly before 6 p.m. Witnesses took their seats behind reinforced glass. When the warden asked whether he wished to make a final statement, Grimm answered quietly, "No, sir." The lethal injection began moments later. At 6:14 p.m., Norman Merrill Grimm Jr. was pronounced dead. Florida had now completed 15 executions in 2025. No other state came close. For legal historians, the year had become unprecedented. For Cynthia Campbell's family, the numbers meant very little. They remembered a lawyer, a neighbor, a woman who walked next door for what should have been an ordinary cup of coffee. She never came home. Trust had opened the door. Violence closed it forever. Nearly 27 years later, the sentence imposed by the courts had finally been carried out. But for those who loved Cynthia, justice arrived decades after the life they treasured had already been stolen. October 2025. 15 executions completed. 15 executions. Florida's pace had become unlike anything seen in the modern era. Yet November would prove even more unsettling. The next warrant belonged to a man whose victim wasn't an adult. She was a 6-year-old child taken from the safety of her own bedroom. Brian Frederick Jennings. The bedroom abduction, murder execution date, November 13, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 45 years, state, Florida. Parents often say the safest place for a child is home, behind locked doors, just down the hallway, only a few steps away. On the night of May 11, 1979, that belief was shattered forever. 6-year-old Rebecca Becky Kunash was asleep in her bedroom in Merritt Island. By sunrise, an entire state was searching for her. By the end of the day, Florida would be investigating one of the most heartbreaking child murders in its history. By November 2025, Florida's execution surge had become unlike anything seen in the modern era. 15 executions had already been carried out. The next death warrant belonged to a man who had spent longer on Florida's death row than anyone executed in the state that year. More than 4 decades had passed since the murder, yet for Becky's family, time had never reduced the pain. According to prosecutors, Brian Frederick Jennings was a 20-year-old U.S. Marine stationed in Japan who was home on leave in Florida. After spending part of the evening drinking, investigators said he walked through a quiet Merritt Island neighborhood during the early morning hours. He stopped outside one particular home. He opened a bedroom window. Inside, a 6-year-old girl was sleeping. Within moments, Rebecca Kunash had been carried from her bed into the darkness. When her parents discovered she was gone, panic spread immediately. Neighbors began searching. Law enforcement officers flooded the area. Roadblocks were established. Helicopters joined the search. Every passing minute deepened the fear that Becky had been taken far away. Investigators would later determine she had never left the county. According to prosecutors, Jennings drove Rebecca to a nearby canal. There, they said, she was sexually assaulted before being drowned. Later that day, searchers made the discovery everyone had been praying would never come. Rebecca's body was recovered from the water. The community was devastated. For detectives, however, the investigation had already begun moving quickly. Crime scene technicians recovered fingerprints from the bedroom window. Investigators documented shoe impressions outside the home. Witnesses described suspicious activity during the night. Then an unexpected break came from an unrelated police encounter. Jennings was stopped on a traffic matter only hours after the murder. As officers continued comparing physical evidence, prosecutors said the fingerprints and footprints linked him directly to the crime. The investigation that began with a missing child had identified its primary suspect before the day was over. The legal journey, however, would prove anything but quick. Jennings was convicted and sentenced to death. Then the conviction was overturned. He was tried again. Another death sentence followed. That too was reversed. Only after a third trial in 1986 did the death sentence remain in place, beginning one of the longest death row incarcerations in Florida history. Over the next 45 years, appeals moved repeatedly through state and federal courts. Attorneys challenged jury instructions. Constitutional claims were reviewed. Questions surrounding legal representation were raised during the final stages of litigation. Each review delayed, but ultimately did not change the outcome. The conviction remained. The sentence remained. As autumn turned toward winter in 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis signed another death warrant. Florida prepared for its 16th execution of the year. Jennings's attorneys filed emergency appeals before both the Florida Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court. They argued that gaps in legal representation before the signing of the death warrant had violated his rights. The courts rejected those claims. The execution would proceed. On November 13, 2025, Brian Frederick Jennings spent his final day inside Florida State Prison. He met privately with counsel. He received his final meal, a cheeseburger, fries, and a soft drink. As evening approached, correctional officers escorted him into the execution chamber. Witnesses gathered behind reinforced glass. Jennings declined a final statement. Moments later, the lethal injection began. At 6:20 p.m., Brian Frederick Jennings was pronounced dead. Florida had now carried out 16 executions in 2025, extending what had already become the most active execution year in the state's modern history. For legal historians, the case stood out because of its extraordinary path through 3 capital trials and more than 4 decades of appeals. For Becky's family, those decades represented something much simpler. 45 birthdays, 45 Christmases, 45 years without the little girl who had been taken from her own bedroom before dawn. Rebecca Kunash never had the opportunity to grow up. She never finished school, never started a family, never lived the life waiting for her beyond childhood. The execution closed one of Florida's longest-running death penalty cases. It could never return the 6-year-old child whose bedroom should have remained the safest place in the world. November 2025. 16 executions completed. 16 executions. Florida's historic surge was entering its final weeks. Only 3 death warrants remained. The next case would take investigators inside a convenience store where a trusted manager's ordinary workday ended in a brutal robbery that would keep the courts occupied for more than 3 decades before Florida carried out its 17th execution. Richard Malik Randolph Malik Abdul Sajjad. The gas station robbery murder execution date, November 20th, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 37 years. State, Florida. Before the execution chamber doors opened, another story had already captured national attention. It wasn't about the murder. It wasn't even about the execution. It was about a phone call. For nearly 60 years, a mother searched for the son she had been forced to surrender as a teenager. When she finally found him, he wasn't living in another state. He wasn't overseas. He was sitting on Florida's death row. The reunion came decades too late. By then, Richard Randolph had become Malik Abdul Sajjad, a practicing Muslim, and one of the longest-serving inmates awaiting execution in the state. By November 2025, Florida's execution surge had become unlike anything in the state's modern history. 16 executions had already been carried out. Another death warrant had now reached its final hours. Unlike the previous episode, this story would not begin with the investigation. It would begin with a life that, according to his attorneys, had been shaped by violence long before the murder ever occurred. Richard Randolph entered the world under difficult circumstances. Born to a teenage mother, he was placed for adoption as an infant. His biological mother spent decades wondering what had become of him. According to those who later represented him, the home that was supposed to offer stability instead became the source of severe physical, emotional, and psychological abuse. His adoptive father allegedly beat him with belts, broomsticks, and his fists. His adoptive mother struggled with alcoholism and recurring mental illness. Supporters later argued those early experiences left wounds that never truly healed. As an adult, Randolph enlisted in the United States Army. Military service offered structure. For a time, it appeared to offer direction. But after returning to civilian life, prosecutors said his life spiraled into drug addiction and criminal behavior. That downward path reached its deadliest point in 1988. The victim was Minnie Ruth McCollum. She managed a convenience store in Putnam County. Co-workers described her as dependable and hardworking. Customers knew her simply as the woman behind the counter. On the day of the murder, nothing suggested she would become the victim of a capital crime. According to prosecutors, Randolph entered the store intending to commit robbery. During the course of the crime, investigators said Minnie McCollum was sexually assaulted and murdered. The violence shocked the local community. A neighborhood business had become the scene of an extraordinarily brutal homicide. Detectives immediately secured the store. Evidence technicians documented the scene. Witnesses were interviewed. As investigators reconstructed the robbery, attention quickly focused on Richard Randolph. Physical evidence and additional investigative findings led prosecutors to conclude he was responsible for the attack. He was arrested and charged with capital murder. The trial that followed presented two sharply different portraits of the same man. Prosecutors focused on the robbery, the sexual assault, and the murder of Minnie McCollum. The defense later argued that jurors never heard the full story of Randolph's childhood abuse, military service, and the psychological trauma that shaped much of his adult life. Those arguments would continue for decades. The jury nevertheless found him guilty. Richard Randolph was sentenced to death. Inside Florida's prison system, his life gradually changed. He converted to Islam. He adopted the name Malik Abdul Sajjad, explaining that the faith had given his life purpose and discipline. Correctional records described him as a dependable prison worker. Supporters said he mentored younger inmates and maintained a strong disciplinary record throughout much of his incarceration. His attorneys argued those years reflected genuine rehabilitation rather than the man who entered prison decades earlier. The courts viewed the case differently. Appeals moved through Florida's judicial system. Federal courts reviewed constitutional claims. Defense attorneys challenged the sentencing process and argued that Florida's earlier capital sentencing procedures were legally flawed. Each major review ultimately left the conviction and sentence intact. As 2025 unfolded, Governor Ron DeSantis signed another death warrant. Randolph became the 17th inmate scheduled for execution during Florida's unprecedented year. Emergency appeals reached the Florida Supreme Court. Hours before the execution, the United States Supreme Court declined to issue a stay. The legal process had reached its conclusion. On November 20th, 2025, Richard Randolph spent his final day inside Union Correctional Institution. He chose a final meal that included a cheeseburger, fries, eggs, a soft drink, and ice cream. Although he had practiced Islam for many years, prison officials reported that he declined to meet with a spiritual advisor before the execution. As evening approached, correctional officers escorted him into the execution chamber. Witnesses quietly took their seats behind reinforced glass. The room fell silent. No final statement. At 6:12 p.m., Richard Malik Randolph was pronounced dead. Florida had now completed 17 executions in 2025, more than double its previous annual record and a pace unmatched in the state's modern history. For legal observers, the case prompted renewed discussion about childhood trauma, military veterans on death row, rehabilitation, and the limits of executive clemency. For Minnie Ruth McCollum's family, however, the case was never about policy. It was about a woman who went to work and never came home. A manager, a coworker, a loved one whose life ended during an ordinary work day because someone chose violence. The execution closed one of Florida's longest-running capital cases. It could not restore the life that had been taken inside that small convenience store decades earlier. November 2025. 17 executions completed. 17 executions. Florida's historic surge was entering its final chapter. Only 2 death warrants remained. The next case would begin with a robbery that spiraled into murder, another decades-old crime finally reaching its legal conclusion as the state's unprecedented execution year drew closer to an end. Mark Allen Gerald's The Carpenter's Betrayal. Execution date, December 9, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 35 years, state, Florida. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't a stranger, it's someone who already knows your home, someone who has walked through your front door, someone who knows when your family leaves for school, someone who knows when your husband is out of town. For Tressa Pettibone, that familiarity became fatal. By December 2025, Florida's execution surge had already rewritten the state's history. 17 executions had been carried out. No condemned inmate scheduled that year had received a stay. Another death warrant now stood ready to be fulfilled. This one belonged to Mark Allen Gerald's. For decades, he challenged his conviction through Florida's courts. Then, after his final warrant was signed, something changed. He instructed the courts to stop fighting. The final appeals would never be heard. But more than 35 years earlier, none of that was imaginable. Tressa Lynn Pettibone was 33 years old. She was a wife, a mother of 2 young children. Friends remembered her as warm, devoted to her family, and proud of the home she and her husband had built together. Months before the murder, the Pettibones hired a local carpenter to perform remodeling work around the house. His name was Mark Gerald's. According to court records, he spent enough time there to become familiar with the family's routines. He knew the layout, he knew the neighborhood. Most importantly, prosecutors argued, he learned when Tressa's husband traveled for business. About a week before the killing, Gerald's encountered Tressa and her children at a shopping mall. The conversation appeared ordinary. During the exchange, Tressa mentioned that her husband was away on a business trip. Investigators later learned that Gerald's also approached her 8-year-old son at a nearby arcade, casually asking what time the children's father would return and when the children normally left for and came home from school. At the time, the questions seemed harmless. After the murder, they became deeply unsettling. On February 1, 1989, Tressa remained home while her children attended school. According to prosecutors, Gerald's entered the residence during the day intending to rob the home. What happened inside quickly escalated into violence. Evidence presented at trial showed that Tressa was bound with a plastic restraint before being repeatedly stabbed. Investigators concluded she fought desperately for her life. Despite the struggle, she never escaped. Hours later, her young son returned home from school. Instead of finding his mother waiting for him, he found her lying on the kitchen floor. The image would remain with him forever. Detectives immediately transformed the house into a homicide scene. Crime scene technicians photographed every room. Blood evidence was documented. Fingerprints were collected. Investigators also noticed that Tressa's Mercedes was missing. Jewelry had disappeared. Yet surprisingly, thousands of dollars hidden inside the house remained untouched. The robbery, prosecutors argued, had not unfolded the way Gerald's originally intended. As detectives reconstructed Tressa's final days, they kept returning to one name: the Carpenter. Witnesses placed Gerald's near the family shortly before the murder. Pawnshop records showed jewelry belonging to Tressa had been sold. Investigators recovered a plastic tie connected to the crime inside Gerald's vehicle. Together, prosecutors argued, those pieces formed a compelling chain of evidence linking him to the killing. The trial began the following year. Prosecutors presented the case as a carefully planned home invasion that became murder. Jurors heard testimony about Gerald's prior work inside the Pettibone home, his conversations with the family shortly before the crime, and the physical evidence recovered during the investigation. The defense challenged the prosecution's theory and continued doing so for decades after conviction. Supporters later argued that important forensic evidence, including blood, fingerprints, hair samples, and a bloody handkerchief recovered at the scene, either did not match Gerald's or had never received modern DNA testing. They also alleged that investigative material pointing toward other possible suspects had not been fully explored. Those claims remained a central focus of advocacy organizations long after the conviction. The jury ultimately convicted Mark Geralds of first-degree murder, armed robbery, burglary, and grand theft. The sentence was death. For the next 35 years, appeals moved through Florida's courts. Constitutional claims were reviewed. Conviction challenges continued. Then, after Governor Ron DeSantis signed the December 2025 death warrant, Geralds made an unexpected decision. He waived his remaining appeals. A circuit judge determined he was competent to make that choice. The execution would move forward without the usual final round of litigation. On December 9, 2025, Mark Geralds spent his final day inside Florida State Prison. Outside the prison, Florida had already entered unprecedented territory. This would become the state's 18th execution of the year. Inside, witnesses quietly assembled behind reinforced glass. When asked whether he wished to make a final statement, Geralds spoke softly to someone by name before adding, "I'm sorry that I missed you." Then he said, "I loved you every day." Moments later, the 3-drug lethal injection began. Within minutes, Mark Allen Geralds was pronounced dead at 6:15 p.m. Florida had now completed 18 executions during its historic 2025 execution surge. For legal observers, the case continued to raise questions about mental illness, waived appeals, and unresolved forensic issues raised by advocates. For Tressa Pettibone's family, however, the legal debates never changed the central truth. A mother never returned to her children. A wife never saw her husband again. An ordinary home became the scene of irreversible loss. 36 years later, Florida carried out the sentence imposed by its courts. The execution closed one of the state's oldest capital cases. It could never reopen the front door for the woman who had once believed she was safest inside it. December 2025. 18 executions completed. 18 executions. Florida's deadliest execution year was almost complete. Only one death warrant remained. One final inmate, one final chapter, and a case that would bring the state's unprecedented execution surge to its dramatic conclusion. Frank Athen-Walls, the home invasion that hid a serial killer. Execution date, December 18, 2025. Time on death row, approximately 37 years. State, Florida. By the time Florida prepared its 19th execution of 2025, something had quietly changed. The headlines were no longer asking whether another execution would happen. They were asking how history had unfolded so quickly. 19 death warrants, 19 executions, 1 year. No state had carried out executions at this pace since Florida reinstated capital punishment in the modern era. Yet the final inmate wasn't remembered only for the murders that sent him to death row. He was remembered because investigators later discovered those murders were only part of a much darker story. Long before Frank Athen-Walls entered Florida's execution chamber, detectives believed they were hunting a home invasion killer. Years later, DNA and confessions would reveal they had actually stopped a serial murderer. The victims whose murders led to the death sentence were 22-year-old Airman Edward Alger and his 20-year-old girlfriend, Ann Louise Peterson. Edward was a young airman stationed at Eglin Air Force Base. Ann was his girlfriend. They were building a future together. Friends described them as an ordinary young couple looking forward to the next stage of their lives. Nothing about July 1987 suggested their home would soon become the scene of extraordinary violence. According to prosecutors, Frank Walls broke into the couple's mobile home during the night intending to commit robbery. Instead, the burglary turned into a fight for survival. Investigators said Walls tied both victims. Edward managed to free himself. He fought back. Court records later showed that even after Edward resisted, Walls continued the attack. Prosecutors said he cut Edward's throat. When the airman continued struggling, Walls shot him in the head. Anne desperately tried to escape her restraints. She never made it. She too was shot and killed. By sunrise, 2 young lives had ended inside the place they believed was safest. Detectives immediately began processing the crime scene. The brutality suggested someone willing to eliminate witnesses without hesitation. Evidence technicians documented fingerprints, stolen property, and physical evidence left behind inside the home. The investigation accelerated the very next day. Wall's roommate contacted investigators after becoming alarmed by his behavior following the murders. Police searched the residence they shared. According to prosecutors, officers recovered property connected to the crime. Faced with mounting evidence, Walls eventually admitted responsibility for killing Edward Alger and Ann Peterson. For investigators, the case appeared solved. What they did not yet know was that it wasn't finished. Walls was convicted in 1988 and sentenced to death. But the legal process took an unexpected turn. The Florida Supreme Court overturned the original conviction and ordered a new trial. For the victims' families, the emotional burden returned all over again. They would have to relive every detail. In 1992, prosecutors presented the case once more. Again, jurors found Walls guilty. Again, the sentence was death. As the years passed, another revelation emerged. Advances in DNA testing connected Walls to the 1987 rape and murder of Audrey Gigi. Rather than face another capital trial, he entered a no-contest plea. Investigators also obtained admissions linking him to the killings of Tommy Lou Whidden in 1985 and Cynthia Sue Condra in 1986. What had once appeared to be a double homicide had become the confirmed work of a man responsible for 5 murders across Florida's Panhandle. The appeals continued for decades. Attorneys challenged the sentence on numerous grounds. One of the principal arguments centered on intellectual disability, with the defense contending that Wall's cognitive limitations should constitutionally bar his execution. Florida courts reviewed extensive psychological evidence. Ultimately, judges concluded that the legal standard had not been met. The conviction remained. The sentence remained. By late 2025, every significant avenue of appeal had been exhausted. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the year's final death warrant. Florida prepared for its 19th execution. On December 18, 2025, Frank Athen Walls spent his last day inside Florida State Prison near Stark. He met with attorneys. He received visits from a Catholic priest. He had a final meal. Outside the prison, reporters gathered for what had become the closing chapter of Florida's extraordinary execution year. As evening approached, correctional officers escorted Walls into the execution chamber. Witnesses quietly took their seats behind reinforced glass. Before the lethal injection began, Walls turned his attention toward the victims' families, stating, "I appreciate the opportunity to say what's on my heart. If any of the members of the family are here, I am sorry for all the things I did, the pain I caused, and all that you have suffered all these years." Moments later, the execution commenced. At 6:11 p.m., Frank Athen Walls was pronounced dead. Florida had completed its 19th execution of 2025, setting a modern state record and closing one of the most active execution years in American history. For legal scholars, 2025 would be remembered as an unprecedented year in Florida's administration of capital punishment. For correctional staff, it marked 19 executions carried out in less than 11 months. For lawmakers, judges, and advocates on both sides of the death penalty debate, it renewed long-standing arguments that would likely continue for years. But for the families of Edward Alger, Ann Peterson, Audrey Gigi, Tommy Lou Whidden, and Cynthia Sue Condra, history was measured differently. Not by records, not by statistics, not by execution counts. It was measured by empty chairs, missed birthdays, unfinished futures. 19 executions brought Florida's remarkable year to an end. They did not erase the decades of grief that had begun with 19 separate crimes. December 2025, 19 executions completed. The execution chamber finally fell silent. Florida's unprecedented execution surge had come to an end. 19 inmates, 19 death warrants carried out. Each case followed its own path through decades of investigations, trials, appeals, and final judgments. For some families, the executions represented long-awaited justice. For others, they marked only another difficult chapter in lives forever changed by violent crime. What remained were 19 stories, each a reminder that behind every execution was a victim whose life ended long before the legal process ever did. 19 empty cells left behind a trail of permanently broken families. But Florida isn't the only state with a dark history inside its death chamber. Click the video on your screen right now to step inside the most controversial execution in American history.